It started with a quiet afternoon in late October. I had just moved to a small town in Washington, a place surrounded by thick forests and narrow, winding roads. I rented a modest house on the edge of the woods, the kind of place where you'd wake up to the sound of birds and fall asleep to the hum of crickets. It was peaceful, almost too quiet. After living in a bustling city for years, the silence felt alien. Next door, there was an old man, probably in his late 60s or early 70s. His name was Frank. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a face that looked like it had seen more than it cared to admit. I learned through small talk with other neighbors that Frank was a retired police officer. He had moved here decades ago, long before the area became a magnet for people looking for a simpler life. Frank was odd but not outright unfriendly. He kept to himself, mostly. Sometimes I'd see him sitting on his porch, staring out at the woods as if he were waiting for something. He rarely said hello and never made eye contact. What stood out most was his habit of keeping his curtains drawn, even during the day. At first, I chalked it up to old age or a dislike for neighbors. But as time went on, small things started to bother me. For one, Frank seemed to know everyone's business. He'd mention details about other people's schedules or habits in passing, as if he was always watching. Then there was the cabin. About half a mile into the woods behind our houses stood an abandoned cabin. It was the kind of place you'd expect kids to dare each other to explore. The roof was caving in, the windows shattered, and the whole structure looked like it might collapse if you so much as breathed on it. One day, I asked one of the longtime residents about the cabin. They told me it used to belong to a man named Roger, who had lived there alone for years before vanishing without a trace. The official story was that Roger had skipped town, but no one ever found out for sure. What made it strange was Frank. He seemed unusually interested in the cabin. I'd see him wandering out there sometimes, especially in the late afternoon. He never stayed long, maybe 10 or 15 minutes, but he always carried a small black bag with him. Curiosity got the better of me one day, and I decided to follow him. I waited until I saw him leave his house and head toward the woods. I kept a safe distance, stepping carefully to avoid snapping any twigs. Frank didn't seem to notice me. When we reached the cabin, he stopped at the front door, looked around as if checking for onlookers, and disappeared inside. I crept closer, staying behind a cluster of trees. The air smelled damp, and the cabin's broken windows stared back at me like hollow eyes. I waited for what felt like an eternity before Frank emerged, his black bag in hand. He locked the door behind him, not that it made sense, given the state of the place, and walked back toward his house. Once he was gone, I approached the cabin. The lock on the door was old but sturdy, and I didn't want to risk breaking it. Instead, I decided to look through one of the windows. Inside, the cabin was a mess of dust and debris. Broken furniture lay scattered across the floor, and the walls were covered in faded wallpaper. But something caught my eye, a small, cleared space in the center of the room. It looked deliberate, as if someone had swept the area clean. In the middle of the space was a metal box. I couldn't see what was inside, but it didn't sit right with me. Why would Frank come all the way out here for that? What was in the box? The following days were restless. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Frank's trips to the cabin continued, always at odd hours. Sometimes it was late at night when the woods were pitch black. Other times it was early in the morning before the sun fully rose. One evening, I decided to take another look. This time, I brought a flashlight and a crowbar. I waited until Frank had returned from his daily visit and was back inside his house. The woods felt different that night. The usual chorus of insects was absent, replaced by an eerie stillness. My flashlight barely cut through the darkness as I made my way to the cabin. When I reached the door, I used the crowbar to pry it open. The wood groaned in protest, but the lock gave way eventually. Inside, the air was musty, and the cleared space in the center was just as I remembered. I approached the metal box and knelt beside it. It wasn't locked, just latched. I hesitated, a sense of dread creeping over me, but I forced myself to open it. Inside were photographs, dozens of them. They were old, black and white, and all of them featured the same man. He was tall and wiry, with a face that seemed permanently etched into a scowl. The man in the photos was Frank. The photos weren't casual snapshots. They were surveillance shots taken from strange angles through windows behind bushes across streets. Each one had a date scrawled on the back in messy handwriting. The dates spanned decades, but that wasn't all. Beneath the photographs was a small leather notebook. I flipped through it and found page after page of detailed notes. Times, dates, and descriptions of people's routines. Some of the entries mentioned names I recognized from the neighborhood. My hands shook as I realized what I was looking at. Frank had been watching people, stalking them for years. A noise outside made me freeze. Footsteps. I turned off my flashlight and crouched in the darkness, holding my breath. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Through a crack in the wall, I saw Frank standing just outside the cabin. He was holding a flashlight, its beam cutting through the trees. He muttered something to himself, low, unintelligible. Then he stepped inside. I didn't think. I grabbed the box and bolted, knocking over a chair in my haste. Frank shouted, and I heard him give chase. The woods were a blur as I ran, the metal box heavy in my arms. I didn't dare look back. Branches tore at my clothes, and my lungs burned, but I kept going. When I finally reached my house, I locked the door and called the police. Frank was arrested later that night. The evidence in the box was enough to warrant a search of his property, where they found even more disturbing items, journals, photographs, and a collection of keys to houses in the area. The neighborhood was shaken. People couldn't believe it, but the proof was undeniable. Frank had been living among us, watching us, for years. As for the cabin, it was boarded up and left to rot. No one wanted to go near it anymore. But sometimes, when I walk by those woods, I can't shake the feeling that someone or something is still watching. I never thought I'd find myself in a situation like this. I'm not the type of person who seeks out danger or thrill. I'm just an ordinary guy, and this was supposed to be a quiet weekend in a rented cabin, a way to get away from the stress of work, the noise of the city, and the endless emails that keep piling up. It was mid-October, 2023, and the leaves were at their peak. Vibrant reds, oranges, and yellows blanketed the forest around me. I couldn't have picked a better time for some solitude. The cabin was about 20 miles from the nearest small town, tucked deep into the woods of northern Maine. It wasn't anything fancy. A basic, single-story structure with a small porch, a wood stove, and no Wi-Fi. That was part of the appeal. No distractions. Just me, the quiet, and a stack of books I'd been meaning to read for months. The first day went as planned. I unpacked my gear, made myself a simple dinner, and spent the evening sitting on the porch with a blanket wrapped around me, watching the sunset. The silence was almost overwhelming at first. No cars, no neighbors, no hum of electricity, just the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze or the distant call of an owl. It was peaceful in a way I hadn't experienced in years. The next morning, I decided to explore the area. I'd read online that there were some old logging trails nearby, so I grabbed a map from the cabin's drawer, packed a small backpack, and headed out. The air was crisp, and the forest smelled of damp earth and pine. I walked for hours, weaving through the maze of trails. The further I went, the less defined the paths became. Eventually, I realized I hadn't seen any trail markers in a while, but I wasn't worried. I had my map, and I figured I'd just loop back around. It was around 2 p.m. when I noticed something odd. The forest felt different. The vibrant colors of the leaves seemed muted, and the air felt heavier. I couldn't hear the birds anymore, just the sound of my boots crunching on the ground and my own breathing. I tried to shake off the unease. Maybe I was just tired. That's when I saw it. Ahead, maybe 50 yards off the trail, was a figure. A man standing completely still among the trees. He was dressed in dark clothing, his face obscured by the shadows of the forest. At first, I thought it might be another hiker, but something about his posture felt off. He wasn't looking at me, but he wasn't moving either. I froze, unsure of what to do. I considered calling out to him, but the silence of the woods made the thought of speaking feel wrong, almost dangerous. Instead, I slowly turned back the way I came, my heart pounding in my chest. As I retraced my steps, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I glanced over my shoulder every few minutes but saw nothing. The forest felt like it was closing in on me, the trees taller and closer together than I remembered. My pace quickened, and by the time I reached the cabin, the sun was beginning to set. I locked the door behind me and leaned against it, trying to calm myself. I told myself it was just my imagination. Maybe the man was a hunter or another hiker who didn't even notice me. But the feeling of unease lingered. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every little sound made me jump. The creak of the wooden floorboards, the wind against the windows, the occasional snap of a branch outside. I tried to read, but I couldn't focus. I ended up sitting in the armchair by the wood stove, clutching a flashlight and staring at the door. Around 3 a.m., I heard it. Footsteps, soft, deliberate, and close. They weren't on the porch, but just outside the cabin, circling it. I held my breath, my heart hammering in my chest. The footsteps stopped at the back of the cabin, where there was a small window above the kitchen sink. I didn't dare move. Minutes passed, then hours. The footsteps didn't return, but I didn't sleep a wink. When dawn finally broke, I felt a small sense of relief. The light made everything feel less threatening. I decided to leave that morning. The cabin had been a mistake. I packed my things quickly, barely touching the breakfast I'd made. As I loaded my car, I glanced around the property. The forest was still, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me from the shadows. The drive back to the small town was uneventful, but I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see a figure standing in the middle of the road behind me. When I got home, I tried to put the experience behind me. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I'd let my nerves get the better of me. But a few days later, I noticed something strange. On the back of my car, smeared in the dirt on the rear windshield, were the faint outlines of handprints. They weren't mine. It was the summer of 1998, and my sister Sarah had just landed a job as a factory worker in a small logging town in Oregon. The factory processed wood from the dense forests that surrounded the area. Sarah was thrilled about the job, even though it was in the middle of nowhere, miles away from anything resembling a city. I, on the other hand, thought the whole thing was odd. The factory was remote, and the workers were provided with small cabins to live in while on the job. It seemed convenient, but something about the isolation didn't sit right with me. Sarah and I were close. She was only a year older than me, and we'd always shared everything. Secrets, fears, and dreams. When she invited me to visit her at the factory during her first break, I reluctantly agreed. I figured it would be a chance to catch up and make sure she was doing okay. The drive to the factory took almost 6 hours, winding through endless stretches of forest. By the time I reached the cabin where Sarah was staying, the sun was already starting to set. The cabins were simple but functional, wooden structures with a single bedroom, a small kitchen, and a bathroom. Sarah's cabin was near the edge of the cluster, with only the forest beyond it. She welcomed me with her usual bright smile, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she seemed different. Her usually talkative and bubbly nature was subdued, and there was a tiredness in her eyes that I hadn't seen before. I chalked it up to the long hours and physical labor. Sarah brushed off my concerns and assured me she was fine. She seemed eager to show me around, so after a quick dinner, we headed out. The factory itself was massive, with towering stacks of lumber and the constant hum of machinery. The workers, mostly men, gave me polite nods but didn't say much. Sarah pointed out the various areas where she worked and explained the processes in simple terms, but she seemed distracted. When we returned to the cabin, I finally asked her what was bothering her. She hesitated before saying she'd been hearing strange noises at night. At first, she thought it was just animals in the forest, but it had started to feel like something or someone was watching her. She mentioned that a few of the other workers had complained about similar things, but no one took it seriously. I tried to reassure her, saying it was probably just her imagination or the stress of the job. Still, I couldn't shake the unease that crept over me. That night, I slept on the couch in the small living room while Sarah took the bed. The forest outside was deathly quiet, and the cabin felt almost too still. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of faint rustling outside. At first, I thought it was the wind, but it quickly became clear that it was something moving, slow, deliberate steps crunching through the underbrush. I held my breath, straining to hear more. The footsteps circled the cabin, pausing by the window near where I was lying. My heart pounded as I stared at the dark shape just beyond the curtain. It was tall, too tall to be a normal person, and it didn't move like one either. The figure lingered for what felt like hours before finally disappearing into the woods. The next morning, I told Sarah what I'd seen, but she didn't seem surprised. She admitted that she'd seen the same figure before, always at night, always just outside the cabin. She said it looked like a woman, but there was something off about it. Its proportions were wrong, and its movements were jerky, almost mechanical. Sarah said she hadn't told anyone because she didn't want to sound crazy. I believed her, but I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to pack up and leave, but another part of me felt compelled to stay and figure out what was going on. Over the next few days, I tried to keep an eye out for anything unusual. During the day, the forest seemed peaceful, almost serene, but at night, the atmosphere changed. The noises started again, rustling, footsteps, and sometimes what sounded like faint whispers. Sarah and I both started sleeping less, too afraid to close our eyes for long. One night, Sarah came back from her shift looking shaken. She told me she'd overheard two workers talking about an old legend tied to the forest. They called it the Wood Woman, a figure that was said to haunt the area, luring people into the woods where they were never seen again. Sarah didn't believe in legends, and neither did I, but the description matched the figure we'd both seen. The turning point came a few nights later. It was past midnight, and we were both awake, sitting in the living room, too scared to sleep. Suddenly, there was a loud bang on the side of the cabin. We froze, staring at each other in terror. The bang came again, followed by the sound of something scratching against the wood. I grabbed the only weapon I could find, a heavy fireplace poker, and crept toward the door. Sarah followed, clutching a flashlight. When I opened the door, the forest was silent. There was no sign of anyone, but the air felt heavy, oppressive. Sarah shone the flashlight around, and that's when we saw it, the figure standing just at the edge of the trees. It was close enough now that we could see its features, or lack thereof. Its face was smooth, almost like wood, with hollow indentations where its eyes should have been. Its limbs were impossibly long and thin, bending in unnatural ways as it moved. It didn't run or charge at us. It just stood there, swaying slightly, as if daring us to come closer. My instinct screamed to shut the door and lock it, but before I could move, Sarah stepped forward, as if in a trance. She muttered something about hearing a voice, something I couldn't hear. I grabbed her arm and yanked her back inside, slamming the door shut. The rest of the night was a blur of fear and confusion. We stayed up, listening to the figure pacing around the cabin. By morning, it was gone, but the scratches on the cabin walls remained, a chilling reminder that it had been real. We decided to leave that day. Sarah quit her job and we packed up everything we could fit in my car. On the drive back to the city, neither of us said much. The figure, the noises, the scratches, it was all too much to process. Even now, years later, I can't explain what we saw. Sarah refuses to talk about it, and I've tried to put it out of my mind. But every now and then, I dream about that figure, standing silently at the edge of the woods, waiting. It was late October 2013 when I decided to rent a small cabin near the US-Canada border for a weekend. I was 34 at the time, working long hours at a manufacturing plant in North Dakota. The job was draining, and I needed some time to clear my head. I wasn't looking for anything fancy, just solitude, fresh air, and a bit of quiet in the wilderness. The cabin I booked was far off the beaten path, deep in the forest about 10 miles from the nearest paved road. It was the kind of place where the world seemed to stand still. No Wi-Fi, no cell signal, just me and the wilderness. The ad for the cabin promised peace and isolation, and the pictures showed a modest, single-room wooden structure with a small porch and a wood stove. It sounded perfect. I arrived just before dusk on Friday. The drive up the narrow dirt road was rough, with potholes and mud from earlier rains slowing me down. Thick pine trees lined the road, their dark silhouettes stretching toward the cloudy sky. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was just a faint glow on the horizon. The cabin looked smaller than I expected, almost lost in the surrounding trees. There was a small clearing around it, but the forest pressed close on all sides. I parked my truck beside it, grabbed my bag, and stepped onto the creaky wooden porch. The air was cold and damp, the kind of chill that sinks into your bones. Inside, the cabin was basic but comfortable. There was a single bed against one wall, a small table with a couple of chairs, a wood stove, and a kitchenette with a propane stove and an old sink. A single kerosene lamp sat on the table, and a stack of firewood was piled neatly by the stove. I unpacked quickly, lit the kerosene lamp, and started a fire in the wood stove. As the flames crackled, the cabin began to warm up, and I felt the tension of the week start to melt away. Around 9 p.m., the rain started. At first, it was a soft patter on the roof, almost soothing. But within an hour, it had turned into a downpour, the sound of water hammering against the roof and windows filling the cabin. The wind picked up, howling through the trees and rattling the shutters. The light from the kerosene lamp flickered, casting shifting shadows on the walls. I sat at the table, sipping coffee and watching the fire in the stove. I felt a deep sense of calm, even as the storm raged outside. But that calm didn't last. It was around midnight when I first heard the noise. At first, I thought it was just the wind, a faint thumping sound, almost like a branch hitting the side of the cabin. But then it happened again, louder this time. A steady, deliberate knock, like someone tapping on the wood. I froze, my coffee cup halfway to my lips. My mind raced, trying to come up with a reasonable explanation. Maybe it was an animal, I thought, a raccoon or a deer. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. The sound was too deliberate, too rhythmic. I grabbed the flashlight from the table and walked to the window. The rain was coming down in sheets, and the glass was fogged from the heat inside the cabin. I wiped it with my sleeve and shined the flashlight outside, scanning the clearing. Nothing. just rain and darkness. I told myself I was being paranoid, that the isolation and the storm were playing tricks on me. But as I turned away from the window, the sound came again, this time from the back of the cabin. A slow, deliberate knock, as if someone was circling the cabin, testing each wall. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I slipped on my boots and jacket, grabbed the flashlight, and stepped out onto the porch. The rain was cold and relentless, soaking me within seconds. I scanned the clearing again, the beam of the flashlight cutting through the darkness. Nothing moved. The only sound was the rain and the wind. I walked around the cabin, shining the light on the walls and the ground. The mud was churned up near the back of the cabin, and there were faint impressions in the dirt, footprints, though they were quickly being washed away by the rain. They weren't mine. A chill ran down my spine, and it wasn't from the cold. I stood there for a moment, staring at the prints, my mind racing. Someone had been here. Someone might still be here. I hurried back inside, locking the door behind me. I stoked the fire, more for the comfort of the light than the warmth, and sat at the table, trying to calm my nerves. I told myself it could have been anyone, a hiker, maybe, or someone lost in the woods. But why wouldn't they knock on the door? Why circle the cabin like that? The hours dragged by. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I heard noises. The creak of the porch, the rustle of leaves, the faint tap of rain on the windows. I kept telling myself it was just the storm, but the unease wouldn't go away. Around 3 a.m., I decided to check the cabin again. I grabbed the flashlight and scanned the room, the beam lingering on the windows and the door. That's when I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Muddy smudges on the inside of the window by the table. My stomach dropped. The prints were on the inside. I backed away, my heart pounding. Someone had been in the cabin. Someone might still be in the cabin. I grabbed the fire poker from beside the stove and started checking every corner, every shadow. But the cabin was small, and it didn't take long to realize I was alone. Whoever had been here was gone. But how? The door had been locked. The windows were closed. There was no sign of forced entry. When dawn finally broke, the rain had stopped. The forest was eerily quiet, the air heavy and still. I packed my things in a hurry, threw them into the truck, and started down the muddy road. As I drove, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone step out of the trees. But the road was empty, the forest silent. It wasn't until I was miles away, back on the paved road, that I noticed the scratches on the truck. Long, deep gouges along the sides, as if someone had dragged a sharp object down the metal. I never went back to that cabin. I don't know who or what was out there that night, but I know I wasn't alone. The thought still keeps me up some nights. The image of those muddy prints on the window burned into my mind. Whoever it was, they wanted me to know they'd been there, and that they could come back anytime. It was the summer of 2015, and I had just inherited my grandfather's old cabin. It sat deep in the woods of northern Maine, miles away from the nearest town. I hadn't been there since I was a kid, but I remembered the trips we used to take up there during summer breaks. My wife, Kelly, thought it would be a nice change of pace from our hectic city life, and her mom, Diane, tagged along since she was visiting us for the month. The drive was long, about 6 hours from our home in Boston, but the further north we went, the more beautiful the scenery became. Towering pines lined the narrow roads, and the air grew cooler and fresher with every mile. The isolation was a little unsettling, but I kept reminding myself it was part of the charm. When we finally pulled up to the cabin, it looked exactly as I remembered. A modest, weathered structure with a steep, pitched roof and a small porch out front. The surrounding forest was dense, the trees casting long shadows over the property even in the late afternoon. The air was heavy with the earthy scent of moss and pine needles. It felt untouched by time, almost forgotten by the world. We unloaded the car and stepped inside. The interior was rustic but cozy, with wooden beams, a stone fireplace, and old furniture that had probably been there since the 70s. Dust covered most surfaces, and the air was stale. It was clear no one had been there in years. Diane, ever the neat freak, immediately started wiping things down while Kelly unpacked in the tiny kitchen. I busied myself checking the old generator out back. Thankfully, it started up with just a little coaxing. After we settled in, the three of us decided to take a walk around the property before sunset. The cabin sat on about 10 acres of land, bordered by a small lake on one side and dense forest on the other. The lake was still and glassy, reflecting the fiery orange and pink hues of the setting sun. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, but I chalked it up to my nerves. The isolation was getting to me, I told myself. That night, we cooked dinner on the old propane stove and ate by the fireplace. The hum of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl were the only sounds breaking the silence. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. Diane went to bed early, leaving Kelly and me to sit by the fire and talk. She seemed content, even excited about spending a week here. I tried to share her enthusiasm, but something about the cabin felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it. I woke up around 2 a.m. to a strange sound. It was faint but distinct, like footsteps crunching on gravel. My heart pounded as I strained to listen. The sound came again, this time closer. I crept out of bed and peered out the window. The moonlight illuminated the front yard, but I didn't see anything. I told myself it was probably an animal and went back to bed, though sleep didn't come easily. The next morning, I decided to check the area around the cabin. I didn't mention the noise to Kelly or Diane. I didn't want to scare them. I walked the perimeter, looking for any signs of disturbance. About 50 yards from the cabin, near the tree line, I found footprints. They were human but barefoot, and the strides were uneven, almost limping. My stomach knotted as I stared at them. Who would be wandering around out here in the middle of the night without shoes? I followed the prints for a short distance before they disappeared into the underbrush. I felt exposed out there, like I was being watched. The dense forest seemed to close in around me, the trees whispering secrets I couldn't understand. I hurried back to the cabin, my mind racing. I spent the rest of the day trying to shake off the unease. We went down to the lake, did some fishing, and even took out the old rowboat my grandfather had left behind. For a while, I managed to forget about the footprints, but as the sun dipped below the horizon, the sense of dread returned. That night, the noises started again. This time, it wasn't just footsteps. There was a faint tapping sound, like someone knocking on wood. It seemed to come from all around the cabin, echoing in the still night air. I lay in bed, my body tense, listening intently. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, and then stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was deafening. The next morning, I told Kelly and Diane about the noises. Diane dismissed it as animals, but Kelly looked concerned. She suggested we leave, but I didn't want to give up on the trip so soon. I convinced her to stay, promising to keep a close eye on things. I spent the day reinforcing the cabin. I checked all the windows and doors, making sure they locked securely. I even set up a makeshift alarm system using some old tin cans and string I found in the shed. It felt a little ridiculous, but it gave me some peace of mind. That night, the tapping returned, louder than before. This time, it was accompanied by a faint, shuffling sound, like someone dragging their feet through the dirt. I grabbed the flashlight and crept to the window. The yard was empty, but the sounds continued, circling the cabin. Kelly and Diane woke up, both of them now visibly scared. We huddled together in the living room, the flashlight beam darting around the room as I tried to pinpoint the source of the noise. Suddenly, the tapping stopped. The silence was suffocating. I held my breath, straining to hear anything, but the only sound was the pounding of my own heart. Then, out of nowhere, a loud crash shattered the stillness. Came from the back of the cabin. I grabbed the fire poker from the hearth and cautiously approached the back door. The door was still locked, but the noise had clearly come from outside. I opened the door slowly, the flashlight cutting through the darkness. The back porch was empty, but the tin can alarm I'd set up had been tripped. The string was broken, the cans scattered across the ground. My hands shook as I scanned the yard, but I didn't see anything. I locked the door and stayed up the rest of the night, sitting by the fire with the fire poker in hand. By morning, I had made up my mind. We were leaving. I didn't care how much I loved this place as a kid. It wasn't worth the risk. Kelly and Diane didn't argue. We packed up quickly and loaded the car, all of us eager to get back to civilization. As we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The cabin stood there, silent and unassuming, as if nothing had happened. But as we turned onto the main road, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Standing at the edge of the tree line, partially hidden by the shadows, was a figure. It was tall and thin, its face obscured by the branches. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just watched us leave. We never went back to the cabin. I didn't sell it, though. It still sits there, forgotten and decaying, a relic of a time I'd rather forget. Every now and then, I think about those nights in the woods and wonder who or what was out there. I'll never know, and maybe that's for the best. Some places are better left alone. The year was 1994, and I had recently turned 31. Life in the city had become too much. The noise, the endless crowds, and the stress of my dead-end office job had drained me. I wanted out, even if only for a little while. My aunt had passed away the year before and left me an old cabin deep in the woods of Vermont. It wasn't much, just a small structure with creaky floorboards, a fireplace that barely worked, and a porch with rotting wooden steps. But it was mine now. I decided it was the perfect place to escape for a month. It wasn't entirely remote, but it was close enough to feel isolated. The nearest small town was about a 40-minute drive, and the dirt road leading to the cabin was barely maintained. That was exactly what I needed. No people, no obligations, just peace. I packed light, some clothes, a few books, and my cat. Max was a scrappy black cat I had rescued a few years back. He was fiercely independent but had a knack for curling up on my lap when I needed comfort the most. He hated car rides, so the drive up was filled with his frustrated meows. When we finally reached the cabin, I parked my old Honda in the small clearing beside it. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine and damp earth. The cabin looked exactly as I remembered from my childhood, weathered, leaning slightly to one side, but still standing. Max jumped out of the car, sniffed the air, and darted toward the porch. Inside, it smelled of wood and dust. The furniture was old but serviceable. A small kitchen with a rusted sink sat to the left, and a narrow hallway led to a single bedroom and a tiny bathroom. The living room was dominated by a stone fireplace and an ancient couch with faded upholstery. I spent the first day cleaning. Dust coated everything, and I found cobwebs in every corner. Max explored, jumping onto shelves and disappearing under furniture. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, I had settled in. I lit a few candles since the cabin's generator was unreliable, and started a small fire in the fireplace. That night, I slept soundly, lulled by the silence of the woods. The second day was uneventful. I walked the perimeter of the cabin, making mental notes of repairs it needed. The roof sagged, one of the porch steps was completely rotted through, and the back window had a crack running through it. Still, it felt good to be away from everything. Max seemed to love the place too. He prowled around the yard, occasionally darting after birds or squirrels. I made a habit of keeping the back door open during the day so he could come and go as he pleased. That night, as I sat by the fire reading a book, I heard Max growling. It was a low, guttural sound I'd never heard from him before. He was perched on the windowsill, his fur standing on end, staring out into the darkness. I put the book down and walked over to him. "What's out there, buddy?" I muttered, more to myself than him. The woods were pitch black. Even with the full moon, the thick trees blocked most of the light. I didn't see anything unusual. No movement, no glowing eyes, nothing. But Max wouldn't budge from his spot, his growl rumbling deep in his chest. Eventually, I pulled him away from the window and shut the curtains. It took him a while to settle down, but he finally curled up at the foot of my bed and fell asleep. The next few days were peaceful. I spent my mornings hiking the trails around the cabin, afternoons reading or writing in my journal, and evenings by the fire with Max. The isolation was exactly what I needed to clear my mind. But then things started to change. It began with the noises. At first, I thought it was just the natural sounds of the woods, branches snapping, leaves rustling, the occasional call of an owl. But one night, as I was lying in bed, I heard something heavy moving outside. It was slow and deliberate, like footsteps. I sat up, heart pounding, and strained to listen. The sound stopped. I told myself it was probably a deer or a bear and went back to bed, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. The next morning, I found something odd. The back door, which I always kept shut, was slightly ajar. I was certain I had locked it before going to bed, but I chalked it up to the old, warped wood. Then Max started acting strange again. He refused to go outside even during the day. Instead, he'd sit by the door or windows, staring out with unblinking eyes. One afternoon, as I was chopping wood, I found tracks in the dirt behind the cabin. They weren't animal tracks, too large and oddly shaped. They looked almost human, but not quite. The toes were too long, and the prints were too deep, as if whoever or whatever had made them was incredibly heavy. I felt a chill run down my spine, but told myself it was just my imagination. Still, I couldn't ignore the growing sense of unease. The nights became unbearable. The sounds outside grew louder, scraping, thumping, and that same slow, deliberate movement. I stopped sleeping, sitting up with Max curled on my lap as we both listened to the noises. One night, the sound came right up to the cabin. I heard heavy breathing outside the bedroom window, followed by a faint tapping on the glass. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. Eventually, the noises stopped, but I didn't sleep a second that night. The next morning, I found more tracks around the cabin. They circled the building, stopping at each door and window. That was when I decided to leave. I packed my things quickly, shoving clothes into a duffel bag and gathering Max's supplies. But when I went to start the car, the engine wouldn't turn over. I popped the hood and found the battery missing. Panic set in. Whoever or whatever was out there didn't want me to leave. I locked the doors and windows, barricading them as best I could. The generator had finally given out, so I relied on candles for light. Max stayed glued to my side, his fur bristling every time a noise came from outside. That night was the worst. The noises were louder than ever, and I heard something scratching at the front door. The handle rattled, and I saw the faint outline of a figure through the frosted glass. I clutched a kitchen knife and waited, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The figure didn't try to break in. Instead, it circled the cabin, testing each door and window. I didn't sleep. When morning finally came, I decided to hike to town. It was risky, but staying at the cabin felt like a death sentence. I packed a backpack with water, food, and Max's carrier. We made it about a mile before I realized we were being followed. I heard the crunch of leaves behind me and turned to see a figure in the distance. It was tall and moved strangely, its limbs too long and its gait uneven. I started to run. Max yowled in his carrier, but I didn't stop. The figure gained on me, its footsteps growing louder and more frantic. I tripped and fell, the carrier flying from my hands. Max bolted into the woods, and I screamed for him, but he was gone. The figure stopped a few feet away. In the daylight, I could see it clearly. It was a man, or had been. His skin was pale and stretched tight over his bones, and his eyes were hollow, black pits. I scrambled to my feet and ran, not stopping until I reached the edge of town. I never found Max. I reported the incident to the local authorities, but they didn't take me seriously. I never went back to the cabin. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear those slow, deliberate footsteps outside my window. It was late October, 2019, when I decided to rent a cabin deep in the woods for a weekend. I'd been working long hours at my job and hadn't taken any time for myself in months. The idea of unplugging from everything, no emails, no texts, no people, sounded perfect. I found the cabin online. It was a small, one-bedroom place, nestled in the middle of a sprawling forest about 80 miles from the nearest town. The photos showed a rustic but well-maintained building with a small porch, a wood-burning stove, and a cozy interior. The reviews were mostly positive. People talked about how peaceful it was, how the solitude helped them reconnect with themselves. That's exactly what I wanted. I drove up on a Friday afternoon. The two-lane road leading to the property twisted and turned through dense trees, the golden leaves of fall carpeting the ground. My phone had lost its signal about 30 minutes earlier, but I didn't mind. That was the point, after all. When I arrived, the cabin looked just like the photos. A gravel driveway led up to the front porch, which faced a small clearing surrounded by towering pines and oaks. Behind the cabin, the forest stretched on endlessly. I stepped out of the car and immediately felt the quiet. No hum of traffic, no voices, just the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind and the distant sound of birds. I unloaded my bags and went inside. The interior smelled faintly of wood and pine, clean but with that unmistakable cabin scent. The furniture was simple: an old couch, a rocking chair, and a small kitchen table with 2 chairs. The bedroom had a twin bed with a thick quilt, and there was a small bathroom with a shower. It wasn't luxurious, but it was exactly what I'd wanted. I spent the first few hours settling in. I unpacked my food, stacked the firewood neatly by the stove, and checked out the trails behind the cabin. The forest was beautiful, the kind of place that felt untouched by time. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. That evening, I cooked myself a simple meal, lit a few candles, and read a book by the light of the wood stove. By the time I went to bed, I felt more relaxed than I had in weeks. I woke up early the next morning, just as the sun was beginning to rise. A soft mist hung over the clearing outside, and the light filtering through the trees was almost magical. I made coffee, bundled up in a sweater, and sat on the porch, soaking in the tranquility. After breakfast, I decided to explore the woods a bit more. There was no marked trail behind the cabin, but I figured it couldn't hurt to wander a little. I packed a small backpack with water and snacks and headed out. The forest was dense, but not impassable. I took my time, enjoying the sound of leaves crunching underfoot and the occasional chirp of a bird. I wasn't paying much attention to where I was going. I just wanted to walk and clear my head. After about an hour, I noticed the woods around me were getting darker. The trees grew closer together, their branches forming a thick canopy overhead. The air felt cooler, heavier. I decided it was a good time to head back, but when I turned around, I realized I wasn't entirely sure which direction I'd come from. I wasn't panicked, yet I'd brought a compass with me, and I figured I could use it to find my way back to the cabin. I pulled it out, but when I looked at it, the needle was spinning slowly, as if it couldn't decide which way to point. I tapped it, shook it, but it didn't help. I felt a small ripple of unease, but told myself not to overreact. I had a rough sense of where the cabin was, so I started walking in what I thought was the right direction. After about 20 minutes of walking, I came across something that made me stop in my tracks. It was a small clearing, much like the one my cabin was in, but there was something in the center of it. It looked like an old campsite. There was a rusted-out fire pit surrounded by a few large stones, and a torn tarp hanging from a tree. Nearby, I saw a broken folding chair and what looked like the remains of a backpack. The place felt wrong. The air was colder here, and the silence was absolute. Even the birds were quiet. I stepped closer to the fire pit and noticed something half buried in the ash. It was a knife, the blade darkened and chipped. My stomach tightened. I didn't know what had happened here, but I didn't want to stick around to find out. I turned and started walking quickly, this time paying close attention to my surroundings. As I walked, I began to notice strange things. Trees that looked familiar but weren't quite where I thought they should be. The sound of branches snapping, faint but deliberate, as if something was following me. By now, my unease had grown into full-blown fear. I tried to quicken my pace, but the forest seemed to close in around me, the trees pressing closer together. My breath came in shallow gasps, and I could feel the sweat trickling down my back despite the cool air. I knew I was lost, but more than that, I felt like I wasn't alone. After what felt like hours, I finally stumbled into a clearing. Relief washed over me when I saw a cabin, but it wasn't my cabin. This one was older, smaller. The windows were dark, and the wood was weathered and covered in moss. I hesitated, but as the sun began to dip lower in the sky, I realized I didn't have much choice. I approached the cabin cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. The door was slightly ajar, creaking softly in the wind. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The interior was bare, just a single room with a cot in one corner and a small table in the other. Dust covered everything, and cobwebs hung from the ceiling. It didn't look like anyone had been here in years. As I stood there, trying to decide what to do, I heard it, a faint noise coming from the woods outside. It was soft at first, like the rustling of leaves, but it grew louder, closer. My blood ran cold. I didn't wait to find out what it was. I bolted out of the cabin and ran blindly into the forest. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually, I saw a light through the trees. My cabin. I burst into the clearing, panting and trembling. I slammed the door shut and locked it, then collapsed against the wall. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept the lights on, the fire roaring, and my knife within arm's reach. Every so often, I thought I heard noises outside, footsteps, faint whispers, but I told myself it was just the wind. When morning finally came, I grabbed my things and left. I didn't care about the weekend or the money I'd spent. I just wanted to get out of there. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a split second, I thought I saw someone standing in the clearing, watching me. I never went back to that cabin. Weeks later, I tried to look up the cabin online to leave a review, to warn people, but the listing was gone. No records, no reviews, nothing. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear those noises in my dreams. The rustling, the whispers, and I wake up in a cold sweat. I'll never know what happened in those woods, and I'm not sure I want to. All I know is that something was out there, and it didn't want me to leave.